Hi, I'm Jeff Day, Senior Editor of Woodworking Books for Rodale Press. And I'm here in the Rodale Editor's Shop with Bill Hilton, fellow editor, who happens to be our main router head. You know, I really enjoy woodworking. It's something I've done for a living. It's something I've taught others to do. And in my current job, I read and write and think and talk a lot about woodworking. But the high point is always getting in this shop and actually making something. It's a great shop. We've done a lot of woodworking here and built a lot of projects. Stick around. I guarantee that in the next half hour, you're going to pick up a few router tips. Maybe even a few you haven't seen before. They're tips that we've picked up from some of the best woodworkers in the country, and plans for any of the jigs we use you'll see included in an insert in the video. But the main thing I think you'll see is that there are as many ways to solve woodworking problems as there are woodworkers. Me, for example, I like to keep things simple. Take these cabinet sides I just datoed. There's nothing new about the T-square I used to make the cut. The arm is perpendicular to the crossbar, and because you guide the router against the arm, the resulting dado is square with the edge of the cabinet. The arm's long enough that you can cut through both sides in a single pass. It saves time, but more importantly, it ensures that the dados will line up, and that the cabinet and sides will be square when assembled. Unfortunately, locating a dado usually involves a lot of measuring. You have to know the exact distance from here to here in order to set the fence. And that usually involves some number like 3 7/64. It's not easy to remember, and it's not easy to lay out either. Let me show you how I set up this cut. The key is this spacer. I made it by guiding a router against a fence and cutting through a piece of masonite. Without measuring, I've automatically got a piece that tells me the exact distance from the layout lines that I need to set my T-square. I just put the spacer against the layout lines and put the square against it. I'll clamp the square in place, and as long as I use the same router and bit, I'll never have to measure again. I like to double check to make sure that this is properly aligned, and when I'm sure that it is, I make the cut. And when I finish, the groove is right where I want it to be.
Don't be too sure about that, Jeff. Those router base plates can be pretty eccentric, you know.
I've got that covered, Bill. You see this spot on the base plate?
Yeah.
It solves the problem you're talking about.
Here's the problem. I just knew this conversation was going to come up.
Ah, the board with the wandering dado. You guide a router along the fence to cut a groove, but as you can see, the groove wanders a little. In fact, Bill, this groove wanders a lot.
Well, so I exaggerated the veer a little bit. I wanted the errancy to be perfectly evident.
Okay. So the groove's not absolutely straight. Is something wrong with the fence? No. Something's wrong with the router's base plate. It isn't perfectly centered on the router.
In this case, it was really eccentric.
If you turn the router as you're guiding it against the fence, you can force the bit away from it. This spot reminds me to keep the same part of the router against the fence for the entire cut. Now, Bill, as long as you're here, you've been touting this double bar jig for routing dados. Is it really that much different than the T-square?
Well, Jeff, I do use a T-square, but I think this jig is easier to set up and more versatile. I use only this router with it and only with a 1/2-inch bit. Yet I can adjust this jig to cut grooves and dados up to about 1.25 inches wide.
Great. I've got a couple more grooves to route. Do you mind if we give this a try?
Be my guest. I see that you have the sides lined up with the tops flush. Now, measure and mark just the top of each dado. All you need is a tick mark.
Okay.
Now, these two crossbars are perfectly perpendicular to this fixed fence. When either crossbar is tight against the edge of the workpiece, this fence will be at right angles to that edge. Now, how do we align the jig? The trick is this notch routed in the crossbar. Because I always use the same router and bit with this jig, that notch tells me how close to the fixed fence one edge of the dado will be. Just align the edge of the notch with your tick mark. If you're going to cut wider than a 1/2 inch, the extra width will always be toward the movable fence.
Okay, let me clamp this in place.
Okay.
There we go. Set.
Now we're almost ready. We want a 3/4 inch dado here, but we're using a 1/2 inch bit. To get the data we want with the bit we're using, we need this second fence, and the distance between the two fences must equal the diameter of the base plate plus 1/4 inch. I use this plywood spacer to set the fences.
I see. You slip it between the two fences, slide the loose one up against it.
That's right.
Slick.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Now we're set for that 3/4 inch dado, but I have other plywood spacers that I use if I want to cut wider or narrower dados.
What's this slot?
Well, that's the spacer's extra dimension. As you know, Jeff, we really should cut this dado in 2 passes, adjusting the router's depth of cut between them. To get more efficient, more consistent dados, and to save time, I like to set my fixed base router to the final depth of cut, then make the first pass with the spacer in place. You can go about a 1/2 inch deep in 2 passes that way.
Well, wouldn't it be easier to do this with a plunge router? You could get to your final depth in easy increments, and it would be easier to start the cut, too.
You're right, it would. But I don't have a plunge router. This is what we call make do.
Okay, so how do you start the cut? Just tip it in?
No. I like to start with the bit and the crossbar notch.
Okay, so you guide the router along one fence.
That's right.
Cutting through both sides. And then you come back against the other, widening the dado. And then I lift out the spacer and repeat the process to finish the cut.
That's right. We have a few more ideas for you on using the router to cut joinery. All involve base plates custom made right here in our own shop. Here we have 3 routers, each with a base plate for a different job.
This first router is fitted with what looks like a square base plate, but it's actually a jig developed by Nick Engler, author of our workshop companion books. The distance from the edge of the bit to each edge of the base plate is different. So with this jig, you can cut 4 different size grooves without having to change the bit. Let me show you how it works. I've got a 1/2 inch bit in here, and I'll guide it against my T-square to make a cut. Now I'll take the side marked plus 1/8 and put it against the pin. As you can see, I've widened the groove. We've set this base up so that you can change the width of cut in easy 1/16 inch increments. It's perfect for cutting those odd-sized grooves.
This second router has a bigger base plate whose purpose is probably evident. It's a homemade edge guide. One of the biggest complaints I have is about the crummy edge guides that come with otherwise great routers. What usually happens is these set screws vibrate loose and the guide slowly slides away from the position you've set. You don't notice it, and your work's ruined. Well, on this guide, these knobs won't vibrate loose. It's got a good bearing surface, long, deep, and it's well waxed. I can adjust this guide from a position tangent to the bit out to one about 10 inches away. With this guide, I can make a straight bit, cut a rabbet, or cut a groove. It all depends on where I lock the guide.
Want to try biscuit joinery? Cut the slots with your router. This clear round base plate makes it easy. The hole in the base is the key. The nice thing about biscuit joinery is its simplicity. You mark the center of the slot, and then you cut it with a quick in and out motion of the tool. You could do the same thing with your router and slot cutter if biscuits were round. But biscuits aren't round, they're elliptical. So you have to move the router from side to side in order to cut the slot. The question is, how far?
The answer is from one side of the bit hole to the other.
Okay, I'll just mark the center of my slot here on the board. And when I'm going to make the cut, what I'll do is I'll set the router on and I'll align the mark with one side of the hole. I'll push the router into the work and move to the right until the other side of the hole aligns with the mark. Here's how it actually works. Done. I've just routed a slot perfect for a size 20 biscuit.
You can make this base plate for the $5 cost of a scrap of acrylic plastic, and that will save you the $150 to $300 cost of a biscuit joiner.
I see Fred's just come in from the prototyping shop. Let's go see what router table tricks we can pick up from him. Unlike Bill or me, Fred gets to spend most of his time here in the shop. He's the shop manager. Hey Fred, how you doing?
Hi Jeff. I've just got a couple of grooves to cut in these pieces of wood. There's already a 1/4-inch bit in the machine, so I'll be out of your way in a sec.
Okay, great. See how easy it is for Fred to adjust the fence? The fence doesn't have to be parallel with the edges of the table. It just has to be the proper distance from the bit. When you need to change the setting, just unclamp one end and pivot. We usually use these vice grip C-clamps to set the fence. This knob here adjusts the distance between the jaws, and as long as you use the same table and the same fence, you'll never have to change the setting. Just grab the plier handles and squeeze. It's locked until you trip the lever. Fred's marking the outside edges of the bit on a piece of tape stuck to the table. He's already marked the beginning and the end of his cut on the edge of his stock. The proper feed direction for this cut is from Fred's right to his left, so he aligns the mark at the beginning of the cut with the appropriate mark on the table. He lowers the stock onto the bit, and when the end of cut marks align, he lifts it off the router and shuts off the machine. You're only doing one of these, Fred.
Well, actually two. If I were doing a whole stack of them, I'd use stop blocks on the fence. You can use scraps and just about any kind of clamp, but these work pretty direct. The hand screw actually becomes the stop. To set them up, I'd use the original cut piece, set it on my mark, and set a stop block for that position. Then I'd move to the finish mark and set a stop block at that position. Now I can take my second piece of wood See? Same cut.
I've always liked stop blocks. I think they make the cut safer and take the chance of error out of the operation.
Yeah, as long as you get them set right. If I were just doing a couple, I'd still just eyeball it mark to mark. But I know, you guys like to be more precise. Speaking of precise, Bob Moran, one of your editors, showed me a trick the other day that's really precise. I think you'd like it. Why don't you let me set that up on the other router table?
Okay, great. We'll be right over. As you saw, it was darn useful to have the router mounted in a table. It was easy, quick, and safe for Fred to pass his stock across the bit. Now, if you're saying to yourself that it's easy to have a router mounted in a table in a shop like ours where we've got an extra one that we can leave there, let me offer you a couple of suggestions. If you've got a fixed base router, buy an extra base and hang it in the table. When you need to switch operations, just pull the router out of one base and slip it in the other. If you've got a plunge router, attach a mounting plate to it, and you can hang the mounting plate in the table. When you need to switch from handheld to handheld operations, just lift out the router and the base, and if you keep the base as small as possible, you'll find the extra size doesn't get in the way and can sometimes be quite useful. If you're thinking about building a router table of your own, here are some design considerations. Mount the router towards the front of the table. Probably 80% of the work you do involves edge cuts, narrow stock, and the like. There's less than 12 inches of space between here and the bit, but it's plenty for most of the work you'll do, and you won't have to lean across the table to do it either. You can mount your fence along either edge or along the back of the work. You can even angle it if it suits the work you have to do. If you're going to do work that requires broad support, work from the back of the table and put the fence over here. Another real advantage to having the router in the front of the table is ease of adjustment. Notice that even though we've built a cabinet around the router, we haven't enclosed it entirely. Ease of adjustment is one reason, but good air ventilation is another. The router cools itself by pulling air in here and blowing it out around the collet. If you enclosed it entirely, these chips would get sucked up into the motor housing and possibly damage the router. It's not a good idea. Well, let's go see what Fred's up to. Fred, you ready?
Yeah, Jeff. What I've got here is a setup for cutting sliding dovetails. This is the piece with the groove in it. I'm closing in on setting the fence to cut the tail. If I cut too much off the tail, it'll be loose and rattle around in the groove. So the trick is I've got to control the movement of the fence. In order to do that, I'm going to take a shim and I'm going to place it against the back of the fence. Then I'm going to clamp a block against it. I'll unclamp the fence, remove the shim, move the fence over, and reclamp it. I've just moved the fence, the thickness of that shim. Playing cards, business cards, pieces of paper, all make good shims. If you want to move the fence a 1/16 of an inch, try a piece of Formica. I'll just take a cut off both sides of this piece in order to keep it centered. Pretty good fit, no?
It's great, and this would work either way, wouldn't it? You put the shim and the block behind the fence to take a deeper cut, but you could put them in front of the fence to take a shallower cut.
That's right.
Now, one thing I noticed, Fred, is that this hole's pretty big. Somebody been raising panels on this?
Probably.
Well, wouldn't that be dangerous if you're working with a narrower piece of stock?
Yeah, it could, Jeff. In order to close that hole down, what you want to do is lower the machine until the cutter's below the surface of the table. Then take a piece of masonite and throw it down on the top. Double stick it fast, and then raise the cutter back up through it. That way the hole fits the cutter. As a matter of fact, there's one hanging on the wall over there that Bill Hilton made for this table.
It still has a tape stuck on it, so we'll just slip it over the bit, stick it down, and a fence would help hold it in place too, wouldn't it?
That's right.
But, hey Bill, what's this nail doing in your fancy looking tabletop?
That nail?
Yeah, that nail.
Well, I needed to cut a disc, so I put that nail through this top to serve as a pivot. Do it on the router table.
I don't think so, Bill.
Jeff, you put the 1/2-inch bit in the router. I'll go cut a blank, and I'll show you.
All right.
I'm going back to some real work.
With the bit retracted, you put the blank over the pivot. Hold it down and switch on the machine. And raise the bit to engage the work. Turn the blank one full rotation. Raise the bit a little bit more and turn the blank again. Eventually, the bit comes through. And here we have a nice round blank, ready for the next operation, whatever that might be. This works well with a plunge router because this micro adjusting knob raises the bit straight up into the work. With a fixed base router, there's a little bit too much side play when you loosen the clamp to raise the bit, and that could booger the work.
Well, Bill, I still prefer the Trammel. Attached to the plunge router, the Trammel is a giant circle cutting compass.
Well, that plunge router is much too big. I prefer this laminate trimmer, which you can hold in one hand.
But Bill, the plunge router makes it easy to start the cut and to deepen it after each lap. With a fixed base router, you're just going to gouge the work trying to start it.
Well, you do have to practice, but it can be done. I say manageability is a big plus in this kind of operation. One hand on the pivot, the other on the router. You don't need 3 horses to spin a 1/4-inch bit.
Well, look, you choose whichever router you want to get. Personally, I've only got one, so it doesn't take a lot of thought. I'm not about to go out and buy another router just to route circles. But whichever router you use, the process is still the same. You drive a screw through the Trammel and into the stock. Or better yet, drill a pilot hole all the way through the stock. That way you can work on both sides of the stock, and you won't have to cut so deeply either.
That pilot hole business was a good point, Jeff. But what if I don't want a hole in my work? What if a pilot hole is going to mess up my tabletop? Here's a Trammel I made that uses my favorite tape, that double stick stuff, carpet tape. This pivot base is the critical part. Put the tape on it and stick it to the work. If the center point is really important, mark it with extended crosshairs, then align the corners of the base with those lines. That's why it's a square, so you can do that. As I said, put the tape on the base and put the base on the work. Now we just get the Trammel point in the base and we're ready to cut. As you see, Jeff, carpet tape holds pretty good. One negative about this setup, as with a router table approach, is that you can only work from one side of the blank. You do have that deep cut to make, but the tape's holding pretty good. Not too shabby, huh?
Not at all. And I like it a lot better than that router table thing. But I did notice you used the plunge router, Bill.
Jeff, could I make one last suggestion?
Sure.
If you have a circle to cut that's smaller than the diameter of the router base plate, don't even bother with a Dremel. Fred drills a hole in the factory base plate. See? Just fit the router over the pivot and turn. It's not flashy, but it works.
Well, Bill, we have time for one last router secret.
Yeah, and?
It's got to be Moran's oval cutting machine.
Epic.
Bob came across this idea while he was thumbing through an old book on carpentry. Back in the 18th century, Benjamin Asher was telling carpenters how they could use this machine to draw ovals. Bob saw it and adapted it to the router. That's what Bob says anyway. To the rest of us, it bears a striking resemblance to the old BS grinder. When two keys attached to an arm travel through perpendicular slots, the arm traces out an oval.
Grind all you want, Jeff. The jig is perfect for these oval tabletops I'm making, and that's not BS.
Show us how this works, Bob.
Well, Jeff, an oval is like a squash circle. It's longer than it is wide. So an oval cutting jig is like a circle cutting jig with a constantly changing radius. The radius changes because the arm is pinned to two keys that slide back and forth in those perpendicular slots. I can just nail the slots onto the back of the stock because I work from the bottom side of the tabletop. I have one more to cut so I can show you how it works.
Okay, great.
First, you draw two center lines on the stock, one the long way and one the short way. Then you position the jig so the tracks are directly over the center lines. Then you nail it there. To adjust the jig, you park the router at the end of one of the center lines, run a screw through the arm into the key that's perpendicular to the arm. Then you move the router around to the end of the other center line, and run a screw through the arm into the other key. As you can see, the screws go through pre-drilled holes in the arm, so the key is free to pivot. And you can make minor adjustments by moving the router back and forth on the trammel rods. What do you think? Will that give me a reasonable coffee table?
Looks like it to me. How do you keep this from shifting as you work?
Shh. I scarfed some of Bill's double-sided tape and used it to stick 80 grit sandpaper back to back. I just slip it in between the stock and the work surface, and it doesn't go anyplace.
And I see your work surface is an expendable piece of plywood rather than the bench top. Well, thanks a lot, Bob. It's been quite an education.
My pleasure. Just don't tell Bill I took his double-sided tape.
Well, I see our time's up. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you've picked up a few tips, maybe even some you haven't seen before, and that we've made your trip to our shop a worthwhile half hour.